Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today with Dr. Charlene Fell, who's going to give us a presentation on generic antifibrotics. Is a rose by any other name? Dr. Charlene Fell obtained her medical degree from the University of Toronto and completed her internal medicine residency and respiratory medicine fellowship training at the University of Calgary. She completed a clinical research fellowship in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis at the University of Michigan. Her research interests include determining the clinical predictors of diagnosis and survival in patients with idiopathic interstitial pneumonias, clinical trials of novel therapeutic agents for patients with IPF, and improving the health-related quality of life for patients with fibrotic lung disease. Dr. Fell is the former chair of the Canadian Thoracic Society Clinical Assembly on Interstitial Lung Diseases and the director of the University of Calgary Interstitial Lung Disease Program. I also want to note that Dr. Fell is the current chair of the Canadian Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Medical Advisory Board, and she's also the voice of our What is Pulmonary Fibrosis webinar. So for any of you who are interested in that, please go to hopebreezehere.com. Dr. Fell.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sharon, for the very kind introduction. And welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to all of those of you who are east of me, and good morning to all of those who are west of me. We're going to talk about generic antifibrotics today in this seminar. Before we get started, I would just like to there we go. I'd like to acknowledge that where I am in Calgary is the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And that includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as Tsuut'ina First Nation just to the west of us, the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wellesley First Nations also to the west of us. And also that the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Just to start, I want to share my disclosures. So I have worked with a number of pharmaceutical companies over the last 15 years or so that I've been in practice. The two big ones that I spend a lot of time working with are Roche Canada, and Boehringer Ingelheim, and these are the two companies that make the branded antifibrotics on the market, pirfenidone and nintedanib. I also have worked with a number of other companies not listed on this slide in terms of running phase 3 clinical trials for novel therapeutic agents. So Novartis, which is important because they own Sandoz, which is a generic drug manufacturing company, as well as Galapagos and a few other companies. I work for University of Calgary and Alberta Health Services and volunteer on the CPFF board as a medical advisory board chair. But I think the most important things that I want to disclose to you are, number one, I am a physician and an ILD specialist, and I am certainly not a politician, a health economist, a pharmacologist, or a pharmacist. The other thing that you need to know is that I am presenting from my home office today, and I have a little dog, and my little dog may want to join the conversation, and I apologize in advance for that. Today we're going to talk about generic drugs, and the focus of my talk is going to be on the generic antifibrotics. Currently, the antifibrotic pirfenidone, which is currently marketed in Canada and North America and Europe by brand name Esbriet, pirfenidone is the drug now in our field that has generics into the market. We're going to talk a little bit about generic drugs, and I'm going to try to help you understand why we even have generics by going through the whole process of drug development. We're going to talk a little bit about patents and pricing. and then compare the development of the branded drugs like Esbriet to the development of the generic forms of drugs like pirfenidone. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about effectiveness of the generic versus the branded drugs. I know a lot of people are interested in this. We'll talk a little bit about side effects. And then we are going to be using the drug pirfenidone as an example through all of the talk. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about Esbriet towards the end of the talk. But I did want to say that although we're going to be spending most of our time talking about pirfenidone as an example drug in terms of generic versus brand name, the things that I'm going to be talking about apply to all generics. And I want to just thank Sharon Lee right up the front here, because I don't think I would have spent very much time thinking about generic medications and why they're so important had she not asked me specifically to address this topic for September PF Awareness Month. So thank you, Sharon, very much. I have learned so much in the last few days researching this topic for you, and I am still learning a lot about it. The generic antifibrotics are just hitting the market now in Alberta. I know in Ontario, they are already there. For the rest of you across the country, they are coming, and I'm going to continue to learn about this new generic environment with all of you as we move forward in time. So thank you, Sharon, for suggesting the topic. All right, so what are generic drugs? So a generic drug is simply a copy of a brand name drug. And this photograph that I stole from this website on the internet is a picture of what you may see in your community pharmacy in the over-the-counter section. And it looks like we are looking at cold and sinus medication on this shelf. So you can see several brand names. So there's a few different forms of Tylenol brand name medications. There's some Benylin brand name medications. If you look down at the bottom, you can see Advil and NyQuil and Dayquil. And then if you look carefully scattered in that photograph, you'll see a bunch of boxes, and they kind of have the same look to the box. There's kind of a purple color on the bottom and a white color on the top and a little round circle on the left. I think it's Life brand, it's hard to see. And that is the generic version of every single one of those branded products that you see on the shelf there. And we're all very familiar with generic brands because we see them every day when we shop for over-the-counter medications. And you may decide that due to the $2 or $3 or sometimes more dollar price difference between the branded and the generic form of, say, acetaminophen, for example. Acetaminophen is branded as Tylenol and then also sold as many different generic forms of acetaminophen. You may decide that you would buy Tylenol brand, or you may decide that you would buy a generic form of acetaminophen for your headache or backache, for example. And if you walk through the pharmacy, all of the different products offered on the shelves have a branded and a generic form. So for example, all of these cough and cold medications, contact lens solutions, fever medications, allergy medication, upset stomach, nausea medications, etc. They're everywhere. These drugs, the generic drugs, have the same medicinal ingredients, so the same actual drug molecule. They have to be the same form, so they have to be a copy. So the generic drug, if it's going to be a generic of a tablet, it has to be a tablet. If it's going to be a generic of a liquid, it has to be a liquid. It has to be the same dose, and it has to have the same pharmacokinetics in the body, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. And so the way it's absorbed into the body, if you either swallow the tablet or liquid, or if you get injection, or if you get it as an intravenous The way that it enters the body, the way that the body metabolizes it, and then the way you excrete it has to be the same. But where they're different is that generics may have different fillers, they may have different colors, and they may be different shapes. And so for those of you who buy prescription medications, and this is just a generic stock photo showing that generic forms of our branded medications are also behind the counter in our prescription medications, you may notice that your pharmacy buys the bulk of their medication from a particular brand like APO or Sandoz or Teva or what have you. Each of the generic brands, all of their pills were kind of have the same kind of shape or the same kind of coloring or the same kind of numerical stamp on them. But they're not going to look exactly like the brand name of the drug. They're going to look a little bit different. So why do we do the generic drugs? What's so important about them? Why do they hit the news? The main reason is cost. In Canada, pirfenidone was the first antifibrotic that hit the market. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about pirfenidone, and I'm going to be talking about Sandoz brand pirfenidone. Sandoz is the first generic brand of pirfenidone to hit the market. So I'm going to compare these two. Apart from Sandoz, though, there are other forms of generic pirfenidone that are approved by Health Canada. And this is a table that I downloaded from Health Canada a couple of weeks ago, and then I had a peek again last night to make sure I wasn't missing anything. You can go to the Health Canada website and search for drug products, and you can type in pirfenidone, and these are the brands, the generic brands of pirfenidone that are approved by Health Canada. So there's a company called JAMP, which you can see in the top 3 rows, JAMP form pirfenidone. The 267 milligram tablet is now marketed and I believe available in Ontario. And then there's Sandoz, which is the first generic to market. So Sandoz has got 267 capsules and tablets, and then an 801 milligram tablet. And the tablets are currently marketed in Ontario, soon to hit Alberta. And then another company called Teva, another big generic brand company. Teva has got approval for 267 and 801 milligram tablets. I had heard through the grapevine, speaking with some of my colleagues in Ontario, as well as speaking with the medical scientific liaison person from Roche. Roche makes Esbriet brand pirfenidone, but I heard from these sources that there are perhaps 2 more generic manufacturers trying to get in on the pirfenidone business. But I couldn't confirm that information on the Health Canada website. So we should stay tuned. So far then in Canada, there's going to be 4 brands of pirfenidone coming up in the next 18 to 24 months. There's going to be Esbriet, which we're already familiar with, manufactured by Roche. There's going to be Sandoz, there's going to be JAMP, and there's going to be Teva. So 4 forms of pirfenidone on the market. And this is not unusual. If you look into your medicine cabinet, you may have 4 different brands of 4 different medications that you're taking. And it all depends on what contract your pharmacy has made with the generic suppliers to get which generic brand of medication that winds up in your medicine cabinet. So I alluded to a few minutes ago that the reason why generics hit the marketplace is because of cost. So this is a graph which provides an estimate of the difference in cost between brand name and generic medications in Canada between 2004 and 2020. And so I'll walk you through the graph, and then there are a few little caveats that we need to take into account when we look at these data. These data are estimates, and when we have estimates, there's always a little bit of error associated with them. So, so each set of blue and black columns are a specific year, starting in 2004 on the far left and going up to 2020 in the far right. The left-hand side, the y-axis, or the height of each bar, represents the retail price per prescription in Canadian dollars for that year. And so what the folks did who generated this statistic was they can look on Canadian administrative databases. They can look at the number of prescriptions filled per year. They can look at the cost of those prescriptions. And they simply took the total number of generic drug prescriptions divided by the total cost divided by the total number. And then they did the same with the brand name medications, the total cost of the brand name medications divided by the number of prescriptions. And that's how these numbers were generated. So in 2018, just as an example, I pulled out to look at in 2018, the cost for brand name prescription is $105.18. And the cost for generic medications is $19.24 per prescription. So the one thing to keep in mind when you look at a graph like this is it looks like a really dramatic difference in the price, but these are not the same medications. So we are not comparing brand name Ramipril, which is a blood pressure medication, with generic Ramipril. No, no, no. What we are comparing in this graph is we're looking at all the generic medications, so all the blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, COPD, etc. medications, everything that has come off of patent. So all medications that are at least 8 years old or older in the black bars, and we're comparing them to brand name medications or medications that are currently still on patent. And these are the brand new medications. And these are the ones that are really expensive. So the antifibrotics, which are the focus of our conversation today, chemotherapy drugs, expensive immunomodulatory drugs. Another class of drugs that's really expensive are all those special drugs that get injected into people's eyes when they have glaucoma and other serious eye conditions. Drugs that are used for organ transplant, for example, to suppress the immune system. So those are the drugs that are in the blue bars. So although this graph shows a very striking difference in the cost of the medications, we're not comparing apples and apples, we're comparing apples and oranges, just to keep that in mind. And the difference in price as we move from branded to generic is quite dramatic, and I will come back and circle back to that later on in the talk. All right, so in order to understand why there's such a big price difference, I thought I would spend a minute or two taking a little detour in drug development. And for those of you who are in Calgary or perhaps have listened to talks either through September Awareness Month with the CPFF or maybe with your local support group, you might have heard a talk about research, clinical trials, drug development. Those are kind of all the same things. You might have seen a picture or a pictograph that's similar to this. And so what I'm going to try to explain to you is what happens from, oh, someone has an idea about a drug that might help with pulmonary fibrosis, all the way to you getting the drug in your hand to take for your condition. So the first stage is, we call it preclinicals, 2 stages of preclinical development. That means preclinical means before it gets to people. So the first stage is usually biochemistry research. Sometimes it's artificial intelligence and now machine learning kind of research. We look at molecules, we look at our known biochemical pathways that lead to diseases, and we try to design drugs, or think about drugs that may block certain parts of the pathway. And certainly both pirfenidone and nintedanib, the two antifibrotics on the market, were developed in this kind of biochemical benchtop base drug discovery paradigm. Once we find a molecule that we think is going to be helpful, actually what we do is we find about 500 molecules that we think are going to be helpful. Then we move to preclinical animal and cell-based research. So we culture some mouse cells, and we try the different drugs on them to see if they're going to block the chemical pathways that we're interested in. And then we narrow from, say, maybe 500 molecules to maybe 100 molecules. And then we start testing the molecules in different kinds of animals. We usually start with the lab rat. And just as an aside, you know, people joke about they don't want to be a guinea pig. Guinea pigs usually don't have anything to do with our research. Usually it's lab rats. And so the next time you joke with your doctor, you don't want to be a guinea pig, say you don't want to be a lab rat. So we go through our molecules in usually a mouse model or a rat model, and we narrow it down to maybe 5 or 6 compounds. And then the most promising 5 or 6 compounds start what we call clinical research or research in humans. I will pop out another slide in a minute to go through that in detail, but there's basically 3 phases: a safety phase, a dosing and a pharmacokinetics phase, a safety phase, and then an efficacy phase. And then once we find out that usually there's one molecule after that we find is effective, it does what we think it's going to do, then the companies have to apply to government regulators to have their drug approved to bring to market to patients. So in Canada, the drug approval process goes through Health Canada. In the US, it goes through the FDA or the Food and Drug Administration. In the European Union, they have their own regulatory body, and so on and so forth. And then after that, there's, it's step number 5 here. We call it a phase 4 study. There's post-market safety data. So there's long-term data collected for the entire lifetime of the drug on safety. So side effects, hospitalizations, anything unexpected that could be related to the drug is collected by both the manufacturer and by Health Canada, and the information about the drug gets updated as we move along. So for example, you may remember, if any of you take antacid medication, you may remember that one of the antacid medications about 2 years ago was recalled because there was a safety issue with risk of cancers and other problems with the antacid medication. And so some of you may be aware of that. And that is just one example of how the system works to continue to track side effects even after the drug has come to market. So just to pull out the clinical research phase, because I think this is important to understand. Those of you who are in the session today who have had interstitial lung disease, maybe those of you with IPF, some of you with rheumatoid arthritis ILD or scleroderma ILD, or maybe these non-IPF fibrosing interstitial lung diseases, you may be familiar with clinical research trials. Most of the big centers running ILD clinics in university hospitals across the country have a research program. Here in Calgary, we certainly do, paused currently because of COVID, like many other places. But we participate actively in the research pipeline to try to bring new medications to the public. So the clinical research phase has 4 phases, like outlined in this cartoon here. Phase 1 is really a safety phase and a pharmacokinetics. And so usually this is testing the drug in a small number of healthy humans who do not have the disease to make sure that it doesn't cause any harm. Phase 2 is looking at the drug in a small group of patients who do have the disease in question. So for IPF, for example, phase 1 would have been done on healthy volunteers. Phase 2 would have been done on patients with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis to make sure that patients do not have any side effects that we might not have seen in the healthy population, and then also to try to find the right dose. And it's these phase 2 dosing studies that come up that help us understand what is the right dose of medication. And that's why pirfenidone is dosed at 267 milligram tablets, and nintedanib is dosed at 150 milligram tablets, etc. Phase 3 are the big studies where we look at hundreds and hundreds of patients taking the medication, and we are primarily trying to figure out whether or not the drug is effective. Does it do what it is supposed to do? And then we have our Health Canada or FDA review, and phase 4 is the safety data that's collected after the drug goes to market, like I talked about. So this drug development program is astonishingly expensive. And so there was a paper published in JAMA last year that estimated that from that eureka moment from a scientist in a lab thinking that a drug or a pathway might be important, all the way to us getting the drug approved by government regulations, that the cost in US dollars in 2020 dollars was $985 million on average. Unbelievable. To put that into context for you, this dollar value includes all of the maybe 500 or 1,000 molecules that didn't make it through the process, that were not effective. So all of the trials that were done looking at 500 molecules in the test tube, or maybe 100 molecules in the Petri dish, or maybe 20 different molecules in the phase 1 study. The cost includes all of that research and development into the drug pipeline. There's some bias in these numbers because these are numbers that are reported by the pharmaceutical industry, so you do need to take them with a grain of salt, but it gives you an idea of how costly these programs are. The phase 3 clinical research programs that I was talking about in this earlier slide, so these big studies that are in purple here, where we test out the drug in hundreds and hundreds of patients, these are the kinds of studies that we are offering in most of the clinics, ILD clinics across the country. Some of the clinics are offering phase 2, but here in Calgary, we offer phase 3 studies. So a study like this, depending if it's 300 or 3,000 patients, usually costs between 5 and 10, sometimes $15 million, depending on how involved the research is. And so the clinical arm of the research pipeline is just a small component of the total cost involved in developing the drug. And that's why it's so expensive. What's not included in the cost are the costs that we call them the innovator drug companies, or the companies that develop the drugs, have to deal with, are the marketing costs. So advertising, all those nice shiny ads that you see on the American TV stations or the glossy magazine ads, the patient support programs, which in our arena in pulmonary fibrosis are so very special and so very critical to the success of patients taking these drugs. And then litigation. And so I don't have a lot of background information on this, but I learned as I was going through the research for this talk that in order for a generic drug to come on the market, there has to be a legal challenge to the patent of the brand name drug. And so the brand name drug companies have to defend their patent in court, and then the first generic to market has a litigation cost to challenge the patent in court. And I don't have too much more information about that, but I am aware that Roche did go through a litigation step as Sandoz was bringing their generic pirfenidone to market. So other costs that are not included in the $985 million astounding drug development cost. In contrast, this is what the generic developers have to go through. So first, about 24 to 36 months out before a drug is going to come off patent, They start looking for drugs that they think would be good candidates for their portfolio. So drugs that are going to have a sufficient patient population or a prescriber base that translates into sales, a drug that is not too complicated to manufacture so that the cost can be kept down. And then they can start characterizing the drug molecule. They can start getting their manufacturing processes up to speed. And then they can start looking at the pharmacokinetics, or the behavior of their generic version of the drug in normal human volunteers. They can start doing all of that work before the branded drug comes off patent. And then they need to submit all of that data to the federal regulator, Health Canada, or the FDA in the US, and they need to have a court challenge. And when they get approval from Health Canada and they win their court challenge, then they can bring their product to market. It takes about 24 to 36 months for a generic company to do that work and to compare it to what the brand name drug developers do. The generic company just does one tiny little part of the research. So this is the main difference between the cost differential between branded and generic products. The other thing that generic products don't do is they don't really advertise, because the advertising has already been done by the brand name products. And so they have a litigation cost, they have a manufacturing cost, they have a regulatory submission cost, but they don't have advertising costs to go through. The first generic drug has a litigation cost. The second, third, fourth, et cetera, generic companies don't have to go to court to bring their drug to market. So they save a little bit of money. So there's an advantage to being the first out of the gate as a generic company, but there's also a disadvantage because you have to pay that court cost. How are we doing, Sharon?
We're doing really well. Thank you.
Good. Nothing in the chat box yet?
Nothing yet.
I should have said, folks, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat box and Sharon will interrupt me for your questions, or we'll have time for questions towards the end. So I wanted again to just compare and contrast the work that's done by the brand name drug companies versus the generic drugs. So when the companies are presenting the drug portfolio to Health Canada, the brand name drug companies have to present the product monograph. So the product monograph is that piece of paper that gets put in the box of your drugs with the print that's so tiny you need a magnifying glass to read it. And it goes through all the important things about the drug, how it's made, the other chemical components, all the research, all the side effects, all the drug-drug interactions. That's the product monograph. So they submit that. They have to submit the phase 1 pharmacokinetic studies, the safety studies through all of their trials, the efficacy studies, which is, does the drug actually work and do what it's supposed to do, all of the expected side effects, and then their manufacturing standards. The generic drugs, in contrast, they submit the product monograph, which is really a cut and paste version of the branded monograph that the brand name drug is already made. And that cut and paste updated product monograph is updated with the pharmacokinetics of the generic version of the drug. They cut and paste the safety, efficacy, and side effect data from the brand name drug, and then they have a piece on their manufacturing standards that they submit to Health Canada as well. Oh,
Dr. Fell, sorry to interrupt. I do have someone who want to ask you, when you're talking about the these drugs and how the side effects and those, all that printed paper and the thing, currently Roche has a nursing program called Inspire, where patients can ask them about these things. Do generic drug companies provide the same service?
Yes and no, and I have a slide that addresses that question a little bit later on in the talk, so we will go through that in detail. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The crux of the main assumption in Canada, the US, Western Europe is that if the two drug molecules are the same and if the pharmacokinetics are the same, then the effectiveness of the drug should be the same and the side effects should be the same. And that is why generic drugs don't have to replicate the entire clinical trial program in order to get their drugs approved by Health Canada, and it saves millions and millions of dollars. So that gets us to the question of effectiveness. Are the generic drugs as effective as brand name drugs? So let's just talk about effectiveness for a minute. So effectiveness is how well a drug does what it's designed to do. You may hear your specialist or your doctors or the news media talk about drug efficacy. So efficacy and effectiveness are the same thing. So does it do what it's designed to do? And what the drug is designed to do may be a little bit different than what your expectation is of the drug. And I think in antifibrotics in particular, this is really important to understand. With other medications like blood pressure medications or diabetes medications, effectiveness is much easier to understand. So I'll just walk you through that in a moment. So the antifibrotics, pirfenidone, which is Esbriet, Roche brand, or now the Sandoz brand, or the Jamp brand, or Teva, or whatever else is coming. So pirfenidone and nintedanib, which is currently marketed as Ofev. These are the two antifibrotics. They are shown in many clinical trials now in the form of pulmonary fibrosis called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, as well as pulmonary fibrosis caused by other things like scleroderma, rheumatoid arthritis, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, etc. These drugs have been shown to slow down the progression of pulmonary fibrosis. And in the clinical trial and in the clinic, we use a marker for progression of pulmonary fibrosis, and the marker is the forced vital capacity. And for all of you who are patients, who have been to a pulmonary lab to do a breathing test or a pulmonary function test, the forced vital capacity is that first test that you do where you take a big breath in and you blow it out as hard and as fast as you can. That's the forced part. And the vital capacity is all the air that you can breathe in and all the air that you could blow out altogether when you blow, 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 blow for those 6 seconds that you're supposed to keep blowing out. So that's the forced vital capacity. That is a surrogate marker for the rate that the scarring is getting worse in the lungs, because when the scarring in the lungs gets worse, no matter what the cause is, the lungs will start to shrink. The size of the lungs will get smaller, and this forced vital capacity test that you do in the lab will start to get smaller. So we measure forced vital capacity as a way for us to figure out if the pulmonary fibrosis is getting worse or not. That's a little bit different than what you might expect. What you might want is you might want to take one of these antifibrotic drugs, and you may want to be able to walk without being so short of breath. Well, that's a different kind of effectiveness, and that actually wasn't what the clinical trials were designed to measure when we designed the clinical trials for pirfenidone and nintedanib. We designed the trials to look at forced vital capacity because that is something that we can standardize across thousands and thousands and thousands of research trial locations and people and languages, etc. So that's the marker that we're left with. So these drugs are designed to slow down the rate that the forced vital capacity drops. And this is just a slide showing the outcome of the ASCEND study for pirfenidone. So pirfenidone went through 4 clinical trials. The first 2 clinical trials were called the Capacity Series that came out in 2007, 2008. And then they had mixed results. And so the FDA in the US wanted the American researchers to do a second set of trials. So then they were called the ASCEND trials. And if you just look at panel B in the top right-hand corner here, there's a graph on panel B. What we're looking at is over a 52-week period along the horizontal or the x-axis. So along the bottom there, going from time 0 out to week 52, we're looking at the change in the forced vital capacity, or by how much the forced vital capacity gets smaller, or by how much the lungs are getting smaller over 52 weeks. And you can see that patients who are taking pirfenidone in this trial, they have a rate of decline or a rate of disease progression in the dark blue line, and patients who are taking placebo or what we call the sugar pill have a rate of decline that's a little bit faster. And so, so what we've shown in this particular trial is that pirfenidone slows down the rate of disease progression as measured by forced vital capacity. So that's what efficacy is all about. Any questions about efficacy before I move on? Anything in the chat box there, Sharon?
No, not the moment, Dr. Fell.
Awesome. Okay. So then I want to move on to another really important concept, which is pharmacokinetics or bioavailability. So pharmacokinetics is a whole branch of medical science, and it is all about studying what happens to the drug after you swallow it, or after it gets injected into your arm, or after it comes into you with an IV. So if we take the example of a capsule here or an oral drug, the drug goes down into the stomach. The capsule or the coating of the drug gets dissolved, and then the drug itself in a capsule is in a powder form that gets absorbed into the bloodstream, usually in the small bowel. And then it goes, the blood from the small bowel goes through the liver, and the liver metabolizes the drug a little bit. We call that first pass effect. And then the drug enters the general circulation, where it circulates all throughout your body. And in the case of the antifibrotics like pirfenidone and nintedanib, we want it to get to the lungs. It circulates to the lungs, and that's where it has its clinical effect. So when we're doing these clinical trials looking at the bioavailability of the drug, we usually do a baseline blood work where we draw blood from the volunteers before they get any drug. We measure whether or not there's any drug in their blood. There should be none. And then they take the drug. And then at certain pre-specified time points afterwards, like say 15 minutes after they swallow the drug, and then 30 minutes, and then 1 hour, and then 90 minutes, et cetera, sometimes up for 72 hours, we draw the blood and we measure how much drug is in the bloodstream. And we construct a curve that we call kind of the pharmacokinetic curve, pardon me. So what I'm showing you on this cartoon is the point in the bottom left of the graph here where you swallow the drug, and then time is marching along on the horizontal axis towards the right. And this time could be measured in hours, it could be measured in days. For some of our drugs that are very long lasting, it could be measured in weeks, for example. So those of you who are taking, say, mycophenolate mofetil or rituximab, the time frame of your drug is very different than the time frame of pirfenidone or nintedanib. Some drugs are very fast acting, like they're in the bloodstream only for minutes. And so this time frame really depends on each individual drug. Once you swallow the drug, it goes into the stomach, it gets absorbed into your blood, and then the liver metabolizes it and the concentration of drug comes down, and then it's eliminated. That's if you take just one dose. But nobody ever takes one dose of the drug. We're taking it like once a day or twice a day, or some other drugs are once a week. Most of us are taking drugs once or twice a day. That's usually how they're designed. And so you can construct graphs if you do this experiment over and over again, and you can see what happens if people take the drug once a day, or you can see what happens if they take it twice a day, and you try to figure out how long does it take, or how many times a day do patients have to take the drug until they get a steady amount of drug in their blood, where the up and downs are kind of minimized. So that's what this kind of, the results of that kind of experiment look like. where we try to figure out what's the spacing between the drugs and what's the dose of the drug that we have to give. So that's kind of in principle what we're doing in these phase 1 trials, where we're trying to figure out the dosing, etc. What we can look at, if we just go back to this curve here, is we look at something called the area under the curve. It's abbreviated as AUC. It is a mathematical number that is calculated literally on the area under the curve. And what we want to do with the generic drugs is we want to make sure that the area under the curve for the generic drugs is exactly the same, or as close to exactly the same as the area under the curve of the brand name drug. And that way we know that the absorption of the drug and the metabolism of the drug is the same with the generic form versus the brand name form. And by extension, we assume that the efficacy is the same. We also assume that the side effects are going to be the same. So this is the data on the bioavailability or the pharmacokinetics of the Sandoz brand pirfenidone versus the Esbriet brand pirfenidone. And this table I pulled from the Sandoz brand pirfenidone product monograph. You can look it up online if you want. I have the website there. For any of you in Ontario or other parts of the country who start receiving Sandoz or the JAMP or Teva generic forms of your drug, you should be able to open up that teeny tiny printing piece of paper and with your magnifying glass, find the section called clinical trials and then find a table that looks like this. And what this is doing is summarizing that experiment that they did with the healthy volunteers to make sure that the drug is equivalent in terms of its bioavailability. So they do what we call a single dose randomized 2-period 2-treatment crossover bioavailability study, which means that they took 42 healthy men and women aged 20 to 59, younger than the average IPF patient, I might point out. And they divided them into 2 groups. And one group started off with the Sandoz product and one group started off with the Esbriet product, and they took one 801 milligram tablet, swallowed it. They had their blood work done periodically. And then they had a washout period, probably a couple of weeks. And then they went back to the lab and they switched. The people who got Sandoz first, then got Esbriet brand. The people who got Esbriet brand, then got Sandoz first. They again took one 801 milligram tablet each, swallowed it, and then they had the blood work repeated. And so all of that data was collected and crunched out and presented in this table here on the right-hand side. And what Sandoz is showing us here is that the area under the curve between their Sandoz product and the Esbriet product, between the 2 different groups, is very, very similar. So the area under the curve with the geometric mean, that's just the kind of the calculated mean is 58,530 or 59,413, pretty close numbers. And again, the same close numbers for the Esbriet brand, 58,146 or 59,055. They are allowed to have a certain amount of variability. And most of the generic versus the branded products are pretty tight in terms of their bioavailability, within about 4 or 5% of each other, which is considered to be perfectly acceptable by Health Canada. And I would say most pharmacologists or pharmacists would consider that to be perfectly acceptable. And I would also consider that to be acceptable. So it shows that the bioavailability of the Sandoz product is the same as the Roche Esbriet product. And so we can then extrapolate that the efficacy and the side effect profile will be the same. Any questions on that, Sharon, before I move on to side effects?
No, not at the moment, Dr. Fell.
Thank you. Okay, we have received lots and lots of questions about the side effects of generic drugs. versus the side effects of the brand name antifibrotics. And I think this is important, especially because with all the drugs that we're using in the pulmonary fibrosis world, whether they are the antifibrotics, pirfenidone or nintedanib, or the anti-inflammatory immunosuppressant drugs like mycophenolate mofetil, rituximab, azathioprine, etc., all of the drugs that my colleagues and I have to offer you in our clinic have a ton of side effects. So the side effect question, I think, is really important. So you might have heard about this study, or you might have heard either in social media or on the news that the side effects of generics are worse than the side effects of the brand name drugs. And all of that chatter on social media or in the news comes from this study that came out of Quebec, about 4 years ago now. It was published in a journal called Circulation, Cardiovascular Quality and Outcomes. And this study was looking at what happens to side effects when patients were switched from brand name to generic blood pressure medications in a class of medications called angiotensin II receptor blockers. Just before I get into this study, there's a question here that popped out from Joan. So Joan, the question was, do generic companies have to provide the information regarding the area under the curve to Health Canada and include it in the packaging? The answer to that, Joan, is yes, absolutely, 100% they do. And the graph that I showed you in the previous slide here comes from the Product Monograph. So you as the patient or the consumer also will be able to see that information as well. Thanks for your question. So just moving on to side effects then. So there was a study that came out in 2017 that looked at side effects for patients taking angiotensin II receptor blockers. We call them ARBs. Before and after the generics came on the market in Canada. So I'll walk you through this study. Now, if you're like me and you have the little video box popped up on your screen, you might have to move the video box because mine is blocking the graph. There we go. So this study is a population-based study using administrative health claims data in the province of Quebec. So what does that mean? So they're not actually looking at people coming into individual clinics. So it's not a doctor like me reporting the data to the study. It is the researchers looking at the Quebec administrative data sets that the province keeps, that keeps track of all the prescriptions filled, and then also keeps track of any kind of hospital or clinic contact that the patient may have. And then there's also a code for what was the problem that the patient went in for. So for example, if somebody is coming into my clinic, they get coded as an outpatient clinic appointment. They get coded as me as the specialist. I put down in my billing that the patient has IPF, for example, so they get a 516.3 code from me. And then I put down that they're coming in to talk about their cough. They get a 786.2 code from me. All that information goes to the province, and they can keep track of these things. And then researchers like myself or my colleague, Carrie Johansson, or my colleagues, Jolene Fisher and company in Toronto, can pull this data and do research on it. So this study looked at patients with high blood pressure on angiotensin receptor blockers, or ARBs. They looked at the rate of healthcare visits and the reason for the healthcare visits, so the kinds of side effects that patients were having before the generics were introduced, and then they looked at that same rate after the generics were introduced. And the graph on the right-hand side is showing us the rate of side effects in the orange dots and line. And then the gray lines show the rate after the generics were introduced. And they show it for 3 different generic forms of 3 different ARB hypertension medications. And the side effects that they were looking at, some of them are related to high blood pressure, or things that would be important in high blood pressure, like worsening high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, heart failure, kidney failure, which can be a complication of these drugs. And then some of the side effects are biologically unrelated to the drug, like diabetes or problems with the valves in your heart. Let me just have a peek at this question before I move on. So it looks like, if we just look at the data here, that the generics had a higher rate of complications, but I think we need to be very careful when we analyze this data, and we need to be careful before we jump to conclusions. So one of the important things about this particular study is that we need to interpret it with caution, because this is a study based on health claims data, and we know nothing about the actual people whose claims were being submitted. So we don't know, for example, how many people in the gray boxes with the generics, how many of those switch from brand name. We don't know how many of them started on the brand name maybe 5 or 6 years later than they should have, because they couldn't afford the brand name and their drug plan didn't cover it. So maybe they were 5 or 6 years later with high blood pressure, and they've already had a heart attack or a stroke, and then their risk of having complications is just that much greater. And we also we are not able to look at this data about side effects and contacts with the healthcare system, and we are not able to extrapolate anything about efficacy of the drugs. So I think when we look at a study like this, number one, we have to be very careful in interpreting the data. And number two, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are more side effects with generics, because what it could mean is that the people were sicker in the 2 populations, and we really just don't know. Sharon, I see you popping up there. Is there a question?
Dr. Fell, a patient wants to know what happens if they don't want to go on the generic drug. You know, they've been on this drug and you've explained that it's the same, but what happens if they just don't feel comfortable and they just, you know, want to stay on the drug that they've been prescribed rather than the drug that's going to be dispensed to them?
Oh, such a good question. And I'm going to come to that in a couple of slides. So I'm going to ask you to hold your thought, and I won't forget about that question. If I seem to forget about it when I start talking about that, Sharon, just maybe pop on again and remind me. I'll get to there, I promise.
Okay.
Okay, so the first thing is, we talked about efficacy of the drugs. We assume that they're the same. Side effects related to generics. Some of my patients are reporting more side effects when they switch from brand name mycophenolate to generic mycophenolate, for example. And I don't know that it is related to the mycophenolate. I think it may be related to some of the differences in the composition of the 2 drugs. And so I think it's important to think about what the drugs are, how the drugs are made, and what may be different between the 2 drugs when you're thinking about side effects. So that effectiveness of the drugs is based on the drug. The side effects may be related to the drug, or it may be related to the other ingredients. And so what I've shown here, again, pulled from the Product Monograph. And so you can look these up yourself, either looking at those like Product Monographs in your boxes of drugs, or going online and searching it up. Following the links on the slides here. These are the medicinal and the non-medicinal compounds of the drug. So in the Esbriet brand pirfenidone that many of you have had experience with, there's the pirfenidone, of course, and then there's all kinds of other stuff. Colloidal anhydrous silica, cross-caramelose, sodium, iron oxide, polyethylene glycol, magnesium stearate, mycocrystalline cellulose, polyvinyl alcohol, povidone, talc, titanium dioxide. Titanium dioxide is what makes the pills really white. Everything else is either filler or color or preservative. The Sandoz version of pirfenidone also has pirfenidone because it's legally required to do that. And then it has a bunch of other stuff, including ferric oxide red, ferric oxide yellow, etc. Some of the ingredients are the same because they're the filler stuff that make the tablets stick together so it doesn't all crumble apart. And some of them are a little bit different. And so it is entirely possible that if somebody's taking a generic drug and they switch from brand name to generic, that the side effects might not be related to the active drug. It may be related to some of the differences that we see here in the composition of the products. If you have a reaction to a drug, whether or not it is a brand name or a generic form, whether it's over the counter or a prescribed drug, you should report it to your prescriber or to your pharmacist if it's over the counter. And you can also report it to Health Canada through MedEffect Health Canada, which is a link on the Health Canada website, or there's a toll-free number here that you can call in. And Sharon will have the slides or at least a video of this talk available at a later date, and you can pause the video or download the slides to get this information as needed. So I'm just going to pause there for a minute. That was kind of a whole discussion about generic drugs. And now I want to switch. I know I've talked about pirfenidone a lot through this talk, but I was talking about general principles about pirfenidone that can apply to basically any other generic drug. Now I want to talk really about pirfenidone, Esbriet versus Sandoz and Jamp and Teva. So I just want to pause here, Sharon, before I make the switch for the last few slides to see if there's any questions that I need to address.
It was just the two that I had asked previously. That was
about what if you don't want to switch?
Yeah.
All right, we'll get there. Okay, so I think we'll get there pretty quickly. So the questions that we've heard from patients are, why can't I get Esbriet anymore? We want to know about the patient support program. And then what do I still need to get my blood work done? So we'll address those in the last few minutes. Okay, why can't you get Esbriet pirfenidone anymore? Well, you can, but you can't. And I'll just kind of go through the details of that. So the main reason why it's going to be challenging to get the Esbriet brand pirfenidone is because they've really been priced out of the market with the introduction of the generics. So branded drugs are the innovator drugs. Drugs is kind of what the pharmaceutical industry calls them, or the branded drugs. They develop their drugs at a cost of $986 million, like we talked about before. And then they, once they get approval from Health Canada, then they go through a set of negotiations with the federal government through a part of the government called the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board, or the PMPRB. So the manufacturer will propose a price of the drug to the PMPRB, and the role of the board is to set the maximum price for the drug. So, so that's the cap of the maximum price. And Canada says you can only charge $100 per pill. That's your maximum price. And then after that, the manufacturer has to go province by province, or sometimes groups of provinces through an organization called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, to negotiate the price of the drug on behalf of the provincial drug plans. So BC Pharmacare, Alberta Blue Cross, etc. And for the most part, the provinces try to have a fairly equal playing field between the provinces in terms of the price of the drug. But there are some exceptions if we move across the country. One of the problems that we have with this process is that not all patients have access to drug coverage through the plan. So for example, in Alberta, where I live and I practice, people have to pay for Alberta Blue Cross. It's not included as part of your universal health care. And the plans that are covered province to province don't include all drugs. And those of you who are familiar with the pulmonary fibrosis story, especially the IPF story, you may remember from 2011, 2012, that it was a slow and painful rollout of getting the price of pirfenidone and then the price of nintedanib reimbursed province through province. And there was definitely inequities across the country, province to province, in terms of patients being able to get access to the drug because one province would pay for it and another province would not. So it is definitely not a perfect system. The main issue, though, is that once a generic drug is approved by Health Canada and then is allowed to go to market, there is a set of rules in Canada that stipulates that the price of the drug has to drop by a certain percentage. So for example, once the first generic drug hits the market, the price of the drug will drop by 25%. And so in the case of pirfenidone, the first branded drug is Esbriet, and they had a certain price. We actually don't know what the price is that the provinces are paying, but if you and I were going to walk to the pharmacy and try to buy Esbriet off the shelf without any coverage at all, we'd probably pay about $30,000, $35,000, something like that for a year. Once the generic, once the Sandoz form of pirfenidone hits the market and gets approved, which it has, the price for everything, all the brands, drops by 25%. And then when the second generic hits the market, and so JAM has hit the market in Ontario, the price drops again to 50%. And then when the third drug comes, so when Teva is approved and hits market, the price is going to drop again. So for example, for that, wonder drug that is $100 per tablet, when the first generic Sandoz brand hits the market, all of a sudden, all of the brands are going to be $75 per tablet. That's what the government will pay the company, only $75 per tablet for a drug that used to cost or used to get reimbursed $100 per tablet. When the second drug comes on board, all of a sudden the government is only going to reimburse $50 per tablet, and so on. When the third generic comes on board, the government is only going to reimburse $25 per tablet. So you can see that the reimbursement schedule drops the price really quickly. And for a branded company like Roche that was being reimbursed a certain amount of money per tablet for Esbriet, now that amount is going to be much, much less.
Excuse me, Dr. Fell.
Yeah.
I want to know, does this apply to the other antifibrotic drug, nintedanib, which is known as OFEV? Does that mean their pricing drops as well?
No, because OFEV is a different drug, and OFEV's patent has not expired yet. So I'm sure that Boehringer Ingelheim that makes OFEV, and then all these other generic companies are watching very carefully what's happening in the pirfenidone market, because the same thing is going to be happening with OFEV. I think we've got 2 or 3 more years left on the OFEV patent before we go through all of this again with nintedanib. So I want to come back and just address the question that came up from somebody earlier about what if you don't want to have a generic drug? So what if you decide that you really like the Esbriet brand? So I think in Canada, we are going to have a challenging time getting the Esbriet brand for you. So if all you have is your provincial drug plan, the provinces, I do not think, in fact, I know the provinces are not going to pay the Esbriet price when they can pay the generic price. And so then if you also have a private insurance company like Sun Life or whatever, Green Shield, whatever your private insurance may be, you may be able to get a portion of the difference in price between the price that the province is willing to pay, say is $25 per tablet, and the price that the tablet is worth, $100 per tablet. So Sun Life or Green Shield or whatever your insurance is, they may also kick in another $30, $40 or whatever. Each insurance company will have a different negotiation on the price with the manufacturer. And then for some people who don't have any coverage, if you really wanted the Esbriet brand, you would have to pay out of pocket the difference between the price that the government is willing to reimburse, any price that your private insurance is willing to top up, which may or may not be significant. Each insurance company is going to be different. And then the cost that Roche expects to be reimbursed for their brand, Esbriet brand of pirfenidone. So I'm curious to know if anyone is on the call from Ontario who was on Esbriet brand of pirfenidone and has recently been switched to the generic brand, either JAMP or Sandoz, if there's been any hiccups along the way with getting you switched between the two drugs, and if the cost of the drug has been covered.
Dr. Fell, I just want to let you know that the Canadian Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation has received many of those patients that have been switched over recently. They just found out when they were getting their drugs refilled, so no one informed them that they were just going to get a generic brand instead of their regular, brand name. And so many of them were really surprised, and they were thought, why weren't they informed that they were going to be switched over?
Oh, I'm surprised to hear that, Sharon. I'm a little bit sad to hear that. Roche has been sending out letters to everyone who's on Esbriet through the Inspiration Patient Support Program. And so here in Alberta, where we're a few weeks behind Ontario, my patients are now phoning in saying, oh, I've got this letter, I'm going to be switched over. So you should have received a letter from Roche itself. And then in Ontario, all of the respirologists are certainly aware that this brand name or the generic version of pirfenidone has been coming and is now here. Unfortunately, what happens with government is they make a decision about when the start date is going to be, and then they tell us that morning. They do a press release that morning. So it was a little bit of a scramble, I think, in Ontario, when all of a sudden everyone found out that I think it was June 30th, the generics were coming to market. Similarly, in Alberta, all of a sudden, we found out that the generics are coming to market. We don't get any lead time from government, but Roche has been sending out written information to Esbriet, patients who are on Esbriet. So I don't know if it got lost. I'm sorry that you didn't get your notification, but you should have received the notification.
Yeah. And the other thing that the Canadian Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation would like to let everyone know is that when Roche had the Inspire program for all those patients that were on Esbriet, it has been announced through our newsletter as well. If you're not on it, you can sign up at cpff.ca, that Dr. Shane Shapira and his team have actually advocated with Sandoz Canada, and they're actually going to provide a patient support program as well. So
oh yeah, I'll get to that in just a sec. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Why don't I get to that? I think it's like one of my next slides.
Oh, okay.
So I do want to talk about the patient support programs. So patient support programs, like Sharon was saying, the Inspiration program is the program that's branded for Esbriet, developed by Roche, and the OFEV patient support program is called the Head Start program. So these programs are critical, and there's a couple of ways that we think about them. So the pharmaceutical companies think about patient support programs as a way to get reimbursed for their drug. It's all about payment and making sure that they get reimbursed properly for their drugs. So you might recall, any of you who are on an antifibrotic, your respirologist has to fill out a form, and we have to say that you've got IPF, and we have to say that your forced vital capacity is within certain parameters, can't be too high, can't be too low. And then we have to resubmit a request for ongoing funding every 6 months or so. It varies province to province. And so from the pharmaceutical company standpoint, that's the primary focus of patient support programs. I think what happened in pulmonary fibrosis that was spearheaded by Intermune when they brought out Esbriet all those years ago, and then adopted by Roche and adopted by Boehringer Ingelheim with Head Start, is the patient support side of the support program. And so those of you who are on these drugs will know that a very lovely nurse will call you and explain the drug to you, talk about how you take it, go through the written materials that you probably received in the clinic with your doctor, or go through materials online, or send you the materials. They'll go through the side effects in detail. Both of these two antifibrotic drugs have certain ways that we go up on the dose, or when you have side effects, certain ways that we go down on the dose, ways that you can adjust your diet to help mitigate some of the side effects. And so this patient support part of the program is really unique and really special in the pulmonary fibrosis field. A third component of the patient support programs, and this is what Sharon was talking about, is providing a compassionate supply of drug to patients, or basically it's called the free goods program or free drug program. So this happens across Canada, except for the province of Quebec, where the law there does not allow it. But this, in the beginning of our experience with these drugs, when these drugs were just starting to come to market, Intermune, now Roche, provided a compassionate supply of Esbriet until the provinces started to pay for it. Likewise, when patients' lungs start to decline, if the forced vital capacity falls below 40%, the province will no longer pay for the drug, or if the forced vital capacity falls by a certain amount, the province will no longer pay for the drug. And the patient support program has agreed that they will provide compassionate supply or free goods to patients so that they can continue taking the drug, the antifibrotic, because we know that the antifibrotic is just as helpful in patients with more severe disease or disease that is getting worse. We know it still works in those patients, but the provinces won't pay for it. One of the big sticking points that we had that Sharon is talking about is that Sandoz could not commit to patients that they would provide a compassionate supply of their drug. Roche has already told us that they are not going to, and in fact, Roche is kind of winding down their patient support program. And Sandoz is very focused on the reimbursement piece. So I've had discussions with Sandoz. I know that they're all about that. They didn't really know very much about the person-to-person, nurse-to-patient, coaching, patient support part of the program when I spoke with them. And so I'm interested to see if they develop that as part of their package with their patient support program. And like Sharon was alluding to, with the help of advocacy from the CPFF and advocacy from Dr. Shane Shapira, Sandoz has recently agreed that they would provide a compassionate supply of their form of pirfenidone if patients no longer meet provincial funding criteria. So hooray, Dr. Shapira, hooray, Sharon and CPFF for that hard work. It's a great victory for patients. And I'm really quite hopeful that now that Sandoz, which is first generic out of the gate, has made that commitment, that the other two will just fall into step and do that. I'm just peeking at the chat box, 10 minutes left. Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm almost done. Okay, so the other question that we've had is a little bit around side effects and what to do. So I've deliberately left out a discussion about where do you get your drug, because I think that is going to be province to province. Sandoz tells me that you should be able to go to your neighborhood pharmacy and pick up their brand of pirfenidone, but I cannot confirm that for the other drugs, nor can I confirm that here in my province of Alberta. So I think that's what is going to happen, but stay tuned. Sharon's nodding yes. This must be the experience for those of you in Ontario so far. If you're switched from one form of pirfenidone or from the Esbriet to the generic, yes, you still need to do your blood work. because the side effects are supposed to be the same, including the risk of inflammation and damage to the liver. So it's still very important that you do your ongoing blood work that's prescribed by your respirologist. Your respirologist may decide to increase the blood work from every 3 months to every month for a little bit after you make the switch. And I think that's part of us just trying to learn these new drugs. So don't be alarmed if your blood work schedule changes. And also, you should pay attention to whether or not your side effects change, especially if they worsen or if you develop any new side effects. Speak to your respirologist, and then if you want to, you could also report them to Health Canada as well with those information that I had in a previous slide. If your side effects get better, we'd also be interested in hearing about that too. So just to wrap up, generic pirfenidone, it looks like a rose, smells like a rose. It is a generic rose, so it's not exactly the same, but it is pretty close. Generic drugs, to summarize, are copies of brand name drugs with the same active ingredient, but the fillers, colors, and preservatives may be different. The generic drugs have the same bioavailability, or that area under the curve that I was talking about, as brand name drugs, and so are thought to be equally effective. And the side effects are felt to be similar. Any differences may be due to kind of those fillers and other ingredients that I showed you can be different between the two products. And currently in Ontario, there are, the generics are on the market. I'd be interested to hear your experience if you want to pop it in the chat box. There are 3, soon to be 4 brands of pirfenidone on the market. So the Roche, Sandoz, Jamp, and then Teva is coming soon, with differences in the patient support programs that we are going to be learning about as time goes on. So to conclude, I just want to point you to this very helpful webpage on the Health Canada webpage, which has, I don't know, it looks like about 15 different questions about generic drugs. I found this to be very helpful in my reading. It's a good jumping off standpoint for you. It's not specific to pirfenidone, but very useful. And most of all, don't panic. We're going to get through this. Many of us are already on generic drugs for our high blood pressure, diabetes, whatever. I think this is going to work too. And the success of moving over to the generics, I think, is really going to depend on the patient support programs and how involved the generic companies decide to get with our patients. Your respirologist and of course the CPFF and your local support groups are here to support you along the way. So please reach out if you are confused about the process, if you don't know where your drug is coming from, if you're worried about side effects. Your respirologist is a great place to start. Your clinic nurse, if you have one, is a good place to start. And of course, Health Canada and the CPFF. So to wrap up, I just want to say thank you. I am so excited to be a part of the seminar series for Pulmonary Fibrosis Awareness Month. If you haven't already gone to the website, please do so. I finally registered for the Clark Walk for Pulmonary Fibrosis. This is me and my dog on Saturday. We did 4K. And I look forward to seeing your stories and watching the kilometers rack up. You can also make a donation on the webpage, or you could support my team. We're called the Vital Capacities. Just saying, thank you.
Great. Dr. Fell, I just want to say that, as always, you are an excellent presenter. You've given us such thorough information that when I asked people if there were any questions, they said that you basically covered it all, and they thank you in such great terms, such understandability. So thank you very much.
I just thank you for your kind words. I just want to address a quick question from Naomi in the or from M Santos 4 in the chat box from Vancouver. The question is, I'm assuming that the requirements of BC Pharmacare will not change for the generic drugs. You are correct. So the prescribing requirements are set by Health Canada in the Product Monograph, and then the provinces adopt those. And so those are going to be the same. Thanks for the question.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Fell. Once again, thank you. This has been a great session as always. I'm sure myself and all the other ones on this webinar have learned so much. And for those of you, just know, as Dr. Fell had said originally at the very beginning, this webinar session will be available by the end of this week. You can go to our hopebreezehere.com and you can go and once again review it, stop it, and write some notes because she's got some really great information in there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.